I was standing in the middle of Chicago Airport when I realized my son had just shut the door on his own mother. My wife had just come out of surgery, and I was stranded by a snowstorm. I called him. I asked him to go pick his mom up and bring her home. He refused. Calm, clean, as if it had nothing to do with him at all. A few minutes later, I saw my wife on my phone screen, sitting alone outside the hospital. She was wearing a thin coat in the middle of a Seattle winter, and she lied to me. She said he's on his way already. Before I continue, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Not to boost numbers, but so I know this story reached a real person in a real place. And now, I'll tell you what happened right after that call. I was still standing at the departure gate when that call ended. The screen went dark, reflecting my pale face under the airport lights. I didn't need to ask anything else. The way Eleanor said, "He's on his way already," it was painfully familiar. That was the voice of a woman who had spent her whole life shielding her child, even while she herself was freezing. Beyond the glass wall, Chicago snow was whipping across the runway like it wanted to erase every trace of movement. Flights were being canceled one by one. There was nothing left to do but wait, but my mind wasn't there anymore. It had already gone back to Seattle, to the hospital lobby where my wife was sitting alone. I called Eleanor again. She didn't answer right away. When the screen lit up, I saw her adjust the camera angle very quickly, as if she was afraid I might see something behind her. She smiled. That familiar smile, thin, careful, trying too hard. I asked if she was cold. She shook her head. I asked if Caleb had arrived. She nodded again, just a beat too slow, and then I saw it. Not on her face, but in the large glass window behind her. The reflection was faint but clear enough. A long row of benches, other elderly people being helped by their children, someone leaning down to tie a scarf around his mother's neck, someone placing a hand on his father's shoulder. And in the middle of all that movement, my Eleanor sat still, her hands resting on her knees. A thin coat, not the warm one I always kept in the car. I didn't say anything. I just looked. She kept talking, saying the nurses were kind, that the surgery went smoothly, that I shouldn't worry. I didn't ask more because I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, my voice would change. When the call ended, I stood there for a long time. People around me were complaining about delayed flights, about hotels being full. I heard everything, but nothing registered. There was only one question left in my head. Why wasn't my son there? I called Caleb. The ringing lasted longer than usual. When he answered, the first thing I heard wasn't his voice. It was music. Not loud, but loud enough to know this wasn't an office. He spoke quickly like he had rehearsed it, said he was stuck, said year-end work was piling up, said he had already booked a car for his mom. He told me not to worry, told me not to make things complicated. I asked him where he was. He went silent for exactly one beat, then said he was at the office. I didn't argue. I just listened. I've been a father for nearly 40 years. I know when a child is telling the truth, and when he's building a wall. And then I heard Bianca's voice, not clear but close enough to know she was sitting right beside him. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't avoid it, just one sentence tossed out like a habit. Hang up. Your mom is old already. She's not a child. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask again. I just ended the call, as simply as he had refused his own mother. My heart didn't race. It slowed down. That feeling was familiar to me. It's the feeling you get when a blueprint collapses, when you realize the foundation was removed a long time ago and you never noticed. I thought about the penthouse I bought for them. I thought about all the times I told Eleanor it's fine, the kids are busy, we can manage. I thought about those evenings I sat alone, believing that as long as I didn't ask for anything, everything would be okay. But that night at Chicago Airport, I understood something else. My son wasn't busy. He was simply choosing something else as more important. I opened the video call with Eleanor again, replayed the last part in slow motion. Not to hurt myself, but to be sure I had seen it right. I watched her pull her coat tighter, very gently. I watched her glance to the side, where no one was, and I saw myself, a husband who wasn't there when she needed me. The snowstorm outside still hadn't stopped, but inside me something else had frozen. Not love, but hesitation. I knew I wouldn't call Caleb again, and I knew I wouldn't let Eleanor get into an anonymous car, heading back to a home where silence was treated as normal. For the first time in many years, I decided not to be the easy father, and that decision began in that moment. Standing in the middle of the airport, a cold phone in my hand, understanding that some doors, once they are closed, should never be knocked on again. I stood there a few more minutes, not because I was hesitating, but because I needed time to think clearly. When you live long enough, you learn one thing. Reacting right away rarely fixes anything. Most of the time, it only makes the mess bigger. And I didn't want Eleanor to become part of that mess. I scrolled through my contacts. There are some people you only call when it truly matters. Julian Vance was one of them. We hadn't spoken directly in years, but I knew one thing for sure. Julian never forgets the people who stood by him when no one else did. The call connected quickly. I didn't go in circles. I told him Eleanor had just come out of surgery, that I was stuck in Chicago, that she was sitting alone in a Seattle hospital lobby in the middle of winter. I didn't mention Caleb. I didn't need to. Julian stayed quiet for a few seconds, long enough for me to hear him breathe on the other end. Then he said, "Don't worry, sir. I'll take care of it." About 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Not a message, a call from Eleanor. She spoke very softly, like she was afraid of disturbing someone. She asked if I knew what was happening. I told her to stay seated, not to stand up, and to put on the scarf the nurse had just given her. Through the screen, I watched the hospital lobby begin to change. Heads turned in the same direction. A car pulled up outside. Not the kind people call in a hurry. It stopped slowly, deliberately. 2 men stepped out first and opened the back door. Eleanor stood up by reflex, probably thinking it was a mistake. But when one of the men bowed slightly and called her by name, I saw her shoulders tremble. Not from fear, but from surprise. A nurse walked over her voice, more careful now. The head physician appeared as well, his attitude completely different. I watched it all on that small screen. My chest felt heavy, but no longer tangled. Julian arrived moments later. He wasn't dressed in anything fancy, just a dark, neat coat. But the way he walked in, the way he spoke, made the space around Eleanor feel organized again. Julian didn't touch her. He just spoke to her the way you speak to family you haven't seen in a long time. Slowly, with respect. When Eleanor turned the camera toward herself, I saw her eyes were red. She didn't say a word. She just shook her head, as if she couldn't understand why someone nearly a stranger was standing there while her own son was not. Julian didn't take Eleanor home. He told me directly right there on the call, that house isn't a good place for recovery right now. I didn't ask anything else. I knew he was right. Instead, Julian took her to the Emerald 5. I had heard of the place, a private medical retreat. Quiet, discreet, where no one is treated like a burden or an appointment squeezed between others. But hearing about it and seeing it are two different things. When Eleanor stepped into the winter garden at the Emerald 5, she stopped. Not because of pain, but because she wasn't used to having someone waiting, someone pulling out a chair, someone asking whether she wanted warm water or light tea. She cried, without sound, just quiet tears falling. I've known Eleanor long enough to understand. Those weren't tears of weakness. They were the tears of someone who, for the first time that day, was treated as if her presence truly mattered. Julian didn't stay long. He told her everything was arranged, that I would be at ease, that she only needed to rest. Before leaving, he paused, looked straight into the camera, and said to me, "You gave me a chance when no one believed in me. I'm just returning it." The call ended. I sat down on a chair at the airport. For the first time that day, I felt my breathing slow and steady again. Not because the problem was solved, but because Eleanor was no longer alone. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, life went on as usual for others. Caleb and Bianca were still posting photos of a late dinner, warm lighting, a wine glass placed just right in the frame. There was no sign they had missed anything important, and maybe in their minds they hadn't. I didn't call them back. I didn't text. This silence wasn't forgiveness. It was observation. I wanted to see what they would notice first. Eleanor's absence, or the fact that she was no longer within their familiar reach. That night, I didn't sleep, not from worry, but from thought. I thought about the years I taught my child that family is the foundation. I wondered when that foundation became something optional, something you could step over if you were busy enough. And I realized something. Some lessons can't be taught with words. They only appear when everything is placed under light. The next morning, when I received a photo of Eleanor sitting in the glass garden at the Emerald 5, winter sunlight resting gently on her hair, I knew I had done the right thing. Not because of luxury, but because, for the first time since the surgery, she looked calm. And in that moment, I understood something simple and bitter. Gratitude doesn't need to be demanded. It only needs an opportunity to appear. Caleb chose not to take that opportunity, but someone else did. Eleanor's calm lasted exactly 2 days. Not because she wasn't being well cared for, but because the outside world finally reached that quiet place. I didn't hear about it from Caleb. Not from Bianca either. I found out through a photo. An acquaintance sent me a link. No message attached. I opened it and saw Eleanor sitting in the winter garden at the Emerald 5. Soft light. Green plants in the middle of the cold season. And behind her, at just enough distance to avoid intimacy, was Julian. The photo itself said nothing, but the caption did. A short, harmless line, the kind people use to show where they've been. Enough for anyone familiar with Seattle to recognize the place, and enough for Bianca to recognize it immediately. The call came that evening. This time, Caleb didn't dance around it. His voice was rushed, mixed with an excitement I wasn't used to hearing when he talked about his mother. He asked why I had hidden my connection with Julian Vance. He spoke as if this were a secret kept from him, not a relationship that had never needed to be displayed. Bianca cut in quickly. She talked about opportunities, about timing, about how Caleb needed capital to expand his project. She spoke as if Eleanor had accidentally been sitting next to a door that could open benefits for them. No one asked how Eleanor was feeling. I let them talk. I listened long enough to understand one thing. In their minds, Eleanor's absence only became noticeable when it appeared on social media. Not out of concern, but because it shifted position. I answered slowly. I said Julian had only helped by chance. I said Eleanor needed rest. I said this had nothing to do with investments or money. Caleb went quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question that showed me just how far things had gone off track. So, can you arrange a meeting for me with him? I wasn't angry. I was tired. But in that tiredness, I realized I needed to do something I had always avoided. Not argue, but put everything back where it belonged. I told Caleb that Julian had invited us to an intimate dinner the following evening. I said it was a rare occasion, that they should dress properly. My tone was calm, no emphasis, no warning. Bianca's voice changed immediately, from urgent to excited, from demanding to flattering. I could hear her already planning in her head. After the call ended, I sat for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel satisfied. I just saw things more clearly than ever. When people grow used to being favored without responsibility, they start to see it as a given. And when that given is taken away, they don't try to earn it back with remorse. They try to reclaim it with calculation. I didn't tell Eleanor about the call. She was practicing walking slowly down the glass hallway, one step at a time. I didn't want to pull her back into noises that would exhaust her. Still, Eleanor sensed something. She asked why Caleb hadn't called. I didn't answer directly. I just said maybe he was busy thinking. That afternoon before the dinner, Eleanor asked me very softly, "Are you angry with our son?" I looked at her, a woman who had spent her life softening every collision, and I shook my head. I told her I wasn't angry. I was just seeing things exactly as they were. The dinner that evening was held at Julian's estate. No noise, no display, but enough that anyone who walked in understood. This wasn't a place for rushing. I arrived early. Eleanor stayed at the Emerald 5, exactly as arranged. I didn't want her to witness what was about to unfold. Caleb and Bianca arrived 15 minutes late. They walked in with the familiar confidence of people who believed they belonged there. Bianca was dressed impeccably. Caleb smiled more than usual. Watching them from a distance, I realized something. In their minds, this dinner already had a desired outcome. Julian greeted them politely. Not cold, not warm. He introduced them to a few people, then left them to manage on their own. I stood off to the side, observing. I didn't intervene. I wanted to see how far they would go, believing there were no boundaries. As I watched, I thought of Eleanor, of her eyes when she sat alone in the hospital lobby, of the way she cried quietly when she was treated with kindness. Those two images never left me. They reminded me this dinner wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. When everyone had gathered, Julian signaled for me to come closer. I stepped forward. Not fast, not slow. Caleb saw me and froze for a second. Then his smile widened, as if everything were going exactly according to plan. I stood beside Julian and looked straight at my son, and in that moment I knew this clearly. This was the last time I would use silence to protect them. After tonight, silence would belong to those who had grown used to treating it as a privilege. The lights in the dining room softened when Julian gently tapped his glass, not to demand attention, but to create space. The conversations around us lowered their volume. I stood beside him, feeling the shift in the air. This was no longer a social evening. It was turning, slowly, but beyond reversal. Julian introduced me briefly. No titles, no achievements. He only said I was someone who had believed in him when nothing was certain yet. I nodded to a few familiar faces. Caleb stepped forward, a practiced smile already in place. He raised his arm, moving in for a hug, the way he always did, as if we were standing in front of a family camera. I stepped back half a step. Not much, but enough to leave a gap. Caleb's smile stalled. Bianca stood beside him, her expression still confident, not yet sensing what was coming. I took out my phone, unhurried. I looked at the screen for a second, as if to be sure I was doing what needed to be done, not what was easy. The room grew quieter. Julian said nothing. He simply stood there, letting the choice be mine. I played the recording. No introduction was needed. A familiar sound filled the room. Not loud, but clear. Background music from a bar. Caleb's voice, quick and precise. Then, Bianca's voice. Uncovered, unguarded. Just one sentence, but enough for the room to understand everything. I stopped the recording before it ended. There was no need to hear more. I looked up, straight at Caleb. My voice didn't rise. I spoke slowly, one sentence at a time, the same way I used to speak to him when he was a boy. I repeated what he had told me, that he was at the office. I mentioned his mother's surgery. I didn't ask why. I simply placed the two images side by side and let everyone connect them on their own. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked around, searching for familiar ground. Bianca leaned forward, ready to say something, but she didn't get the chance. Julian stepped in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He said only one thing, clearly, that he does not work with people who don't know how to place family where it belongs. Not out of moral superiority, but because how someone treats their parents usually reflects how they treat every other commitment. The words landed like a door quietly closing. No noise, but final. Bianca stiffened. Caleb stumbled through a few explanations. He spoke of misunderstandings, of work pressure, of how things weren't as simple as they sounded. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. But when he turned to me, that familiar look of appeal in his eyes, I knew I could no longer step into my old role. I told him I had heard enough, that sometimes silence is mercy, but sometimes silence only stretches a mistake. I said tonight wasn't about humiliating him. It was about drawing a line. Julian made a small gesture. 2 security staff approached. They didn't touch anyone. They simply stood where the message became unmistakable. Caleb and Bianca were escorted out. Politely, without argument, eyes followed them. Not with judgment, just acknowledgement. When the door closed behind them, the room didn't erupt. People returned to their tables, but the rhythm of conversation had changed. I knew this night would be remembered, not for drama, but for its clarity. I excused myself early. Julian walked me into the hallway. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't congratulate me. He only placed a hand on my shoulder for a brief moment, a quiet acknowledgement that some decisions cannot be carried by anyone else. On the way back, I called Eleanor. She answered right away. Her voice was steady, tired but all right. I didn't give details. I only said everything had been said. She was quiet for a moment, then said she had guessed as much. No blame, no questions. When I returned to the Emerald V, Eleanor was sitting by the window. She asked if I was tired. I said yes, but the kind of tiredness that comes after doing something necessary. She nodded, as if she understood. That night, I didn't fall asleep right away. I sat watching the lights of Seattle fade into the mist. I thought of Caleb, of Bianca, Of the years I chose ease to keep the surface calm, I didn't feel relieved, but I felt straighter. Some masks don't need to be torn off. You only need to place them under the light, and they will fall on their own. And when that happens, what matters isn't who is seen, but who is brave enough not to look away. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, not because I couldn't sleep, but because my body had grown used to rising before the city found its noise. Eleanor was still asleep. Her breathing was steadier than it had been in days. I stood by the glass for a while, watching a thin layer of mist settle over the winter garden at the Emerald 5. It was so quiet. I could hear my own thoughts clearly. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel empty either. I felt clear. Clear about what needed to be held on to and what needed to be set down. I called my lawyer. A short call. I said exactly what needed to be said, without emotion. The penthouse in Seattle where Caleb and Bianca were living was to be transferred into a charitable trust for elderly people living alone. Not to make an example, not to punish. I simply wanted it to return to its original meaning. A home created to protect, not to display. My lawyer asked if I was sure. I told him I had been sure since the moment I saw Eleanor sitting alone outside the hospital. Some decisions don't require more proof. Around noon I spoke with Eleanor. I didn't explain at length. I told her what I had done and why. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she placed her hand over mine. Gentle, but firm. She said she wanted to sign a waiver of inheritance rights for Caleb, not out of bitterness, but because she didn't want the rest of her life tied to waiting for someone else to change. I looked at her and saw something new. The familiar resignation was gone. What remained was the calm of someone who had chosen her own boundaries. I nodded. We did it quietly. No tears, no accusations. Just something that should have been done a long time ago. That afternoon, Caleb called. His voice was lower than usual. He asked if I really intended to do this. I didn't explain. I told him he had 24 hours to make arrangements. Not because I wanted to push him out, but because I believe adults must learn to stand on their own feet, even if it comes late. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I understand. I don't know how much he understood, but for the first time in a long while I didn't soften my words to pull him back. That evening Julian stopped by. No business talk. He just asked if Eleanor needed anything else. Before leaving, he said he had arranged a private flight for us back to Chicago the next morning. I thanked him. Not for the convenience, but for the thoughtfulness that didn't need to be shown off. The following morning, we left Seattle. On the plane, Eleanor sat beside me. She held my hand. Not tight, not loose. The city faded beneath the clouds. I didn't look back, not because there was nothing left there, but because what mattered most was already beside me. In Chicago, the ceremony was simple. I walked on stage to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. Looking out into the audience, I saw Eleanor in the front row. She didn't clap loudly. She just smiled. I understood that smile better than any praise. When I spoke, I didn't talk about projects or reputation. I talked about invisible foundations, about how a house only stands firm when the people inside it are respected. I spoke briefly, the way I always do. I didn't need to tell my story. Those who needed to understand did. Back at the hotel, we had an early dinner. Eleanor ate more than she had the night before. She said she wanted to donate part of our assets to a nursing home near where we once lived. I told her I would do it with her. Not as a grand plan, but as something small and steady. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams. When I woke up, my chest felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped trying to please everyone. A few weeks later, I heard that Caleb had moved out. No public complaints, no posts filled with blame. I took that as a quiet beginning. Maybe he would learn something. Maybe not. That was no longer mine to decide. Eleanor continued to recover. We walked every morning, slowly, evenly. I listened as she talked about small things, and I realized something. When respect is placed back where it belongs, old age isn't a narrowing. It's a kind of freedom. My story ends there. No long applause, no winners or losers. Just two older people holding hands, knowing that money can buy comfort, but only gratitude and boundaries bring peace. And for me, that is enough. If you stayed with me until these final moments, thank you. My story isn't meant to blame anyone. It's a reminder that care doesn't have to be grand. It only has to be timely. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe, tap like, and share it with someone you love. They might be waiting for a call, a ride home, or simply your presence. The lesson I learned very late in life is this: parents don't need to be remembered after they're gone. They only need to be valued while they are still here.